At dawn in Johannesburg, a grandmother sits alone in her small living room, the kind with thin curtains that let the morning light in whether you want it or not. She turns on the television expecting weather updates and the usual talk about electricity cuts. Instead, a breaking news banner flashes across the screen: United States boycotts G20 summit in South Africa. For a moment, she doesn't react. She has lived long enough to know that when powerful nations make sudden moves, the consequences often reach the poorest homes first. But then the images shift an empty section in the G20 hall where the U.S. delegation was supposed to sit. A chair left vacant. A silence that feels heavier than words. And she whispers to herself, "Why now? Why us? What does this mean for Africa? And for my grandchildren?" What happened between Washington and Pretoria this week is not just another diplomatic quarrel. It is something deeper, something older, something that reaches into the very question of Africa's place in the world. When a superpower refuses to walk into a room, it sends a message far beyond that room. And when Africa hosts the gathering, the message lands differently, like history knocking at the continent's door and asking, have you grown up, or are you still waiting for someone else to give you permission to exist? This story isn't only about G20 politics, it's about pride perception and a struggle for dignity that has spanned generations. It's about what happens when an African nation finally asserts itself on the global stage, and how the world reacts when it does. So, stay with me, because in what unfolded at this summit we see not only South Africa's test, but a mirror held up for the entire continent and for those of us watching from afar. And before this video ends, I want to ask you a simple, unsettling question. Is Africa finally stepping into adulthood, or is the world determined to keep it in childhood? If you care about truth more than headlines, and if you believe ordinary people deserve honest answers, then this is a journey worth taking. The G20 stage, the empty chair, and the accusation that shocked the world. To understand why the U.S. boycott of the G20 summit in South Africa matters so profoundly, we must begin with the institution itself. The G20 is not a symbolic forum, not a talking shop, and certainly not a place where nations gather for polite conversation. It is one of the world's most powerful political and economic engines. 19 countries, the European Union, and now, after decades of struggle, the African Union sitting among them as an equal. Together, they represent the overwhelming majority of global GDP, world trade, and nearly 2/3 of humanity. Decisions forged in this arena ripple into every currency, every market, every negotiation, from food imports to energy supply. South Africa did not enter this circle as a tourist or a grateful guest. It entered as a founding member, a nation that helped shape the G20's architecture when the world reeled from the 2008 financial crisis. And in 2025, as it assumed the presidency, South Africa made a deliberate choice. This would not be a year where Africa simply watched from the sidelines. It invited 16 guest nations, many of them African and regional bodies, to ensure that the continent would not only be on the menu, as the old saying goes, but finally, undeniably, at the table. The agenda South Africa placed before the G20 was not self-serving. It was bold, demanding, and in many ways overdue. It centered on 4 burning realities: unsustainable debt-choking African economies, inequality both within societies and across continents, climate justice recognizing that those who pollute least suffer most, and the urgent question of critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, platinum, and whether Africa will remain a quarry supplying others or finally become a workshop shaping its own destiny. By all accounts, these priorities resonated with the majority of G20 members. Delegates attended preparatory meetings throughout the year, contributed to frameworks, and endorsed the direction South Africa was steering. All except one. The United States, a founding member and the nation set to inherit the presidency after South Africa made a decision that startled diplomats across the globe. It refused to attend the leaders' summit. It boycotted key meetings. It allowed its chair in Pretoria to sit empty under the lights of the world's cameras. And this was no scheduling oversight, no logistical mishap. It was a calculated political statement. But the reasoning Washington offered stunned even seasoned observers. It did not argue that South Africa's agenda was misguided. It did not question procedural fairness or organizational competence. Instead, it accused South Africa of something far more severe, far more volatile: committing genocide against white South Africans, particularly Afrikaners, stealing land, persecuting a racial minority, encouraging violence against farmers. For millions watching around the world, the claim landed like a thunderclap. To be clear, violent crime on South African farms is real. Farmers have been robbed, attacked, and tragically, some have been killed. In a nation struggling with deep social fractures and one of the world's highest crime rates, every life lost is a wound. Yet the allegation of a coordinated state-sponsored white genocide does not arise from credible human rights institutions. It does not come from researchers' courts or independent observers. It emerges from the swamp of extremist propaganda nurtured by groups who have long resented South Africa's transition to majority rule. By elevating these fringe narratives into the heart of its foreign policy, the United States transformed a domestic myth into an international weapon. And when Washington used this accusation to justify its absence at the G20, then hinted that South Africa might not be invited to the next summit on American soil, it crossed a line from diplomacy into something resembling punishment. This is why the empty chair mattered. It was a reminder that when a powerful nation chooses to act on misinformation, the consequences can destabilize trust at the highest levels of global governance. And it forced Africa and the world to confront an uncomfortable question. Is G20 membership a right secured by international agreements or a privilege granted or revoked based on a president's personal sentiment? South Africa answered firmly, it is a right, not a favor. A future host may choose its dinner guests, but it cannot rewrite the list of G20 members. Pretoria made it clear it would continue to participate as a full and active member, and in doing so, it signaled something larger that Africa will no longer bow its head when misinformation is weaponized against it. The climax, a manufactured genocide, a real national horror, and Africa's crisis of credibility. When the United States raised the claim of white genocide, the world did not simply hear an accusation. It heard an echo of something darker, older, and deeply manipulative. The phrase itself carries the weight of history's worst crimes. It evokes images of state machinery hunting a people down because of who they are. For many Americans watching from home, the accusation may have triggered memories of South Africa's apartheid past memories, still raw even decades later. And that is precisely why the allegation hits so hard. But the truth is more complicated and far more painful. South Africa does not have a policy targeting white people. It does not have a parliamentary motion calling for their elimination, nor any executive order directing violence. What it does have is what many countries, including the United States, quietly struggle with: a staggering national crime epidemic that scars every community, every race, every province. In the crowded townships of Soweto, in the dense informal settlements of Cape Town, on the trains that carry workers each dawn, in the taxis weaving through Durban's traffic, Black South Africans are killed at rates that defy comprehension. They are robbed, assaulted, kidnapped, and murdered in numbers far exceeding what occurs on farms. Yet when you compare the global attention, the imbalance is almost cruel. Because while a mythologized white genocide explodes across foreign news cycles, a very real, very documented war is being waged inside South Africa every single day: the war against women and girls. Gender-based violence is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a national emergency. Women are beaten in their homes. Children are assaulted in schools. Young girls go missing only to be found lifeless days later. South Africa's own government has declared gender-based violence and femicide a national disaster, a disease tearing at the fabric of a nation still healing from its past. And yet this catastrophe receives only a fraction of the outrage reserved for a fictional genocide against a racial minority. This is where the emotional climax of the G20 dispute emerges: a lie received more global sympathy than the lives of millions of real victims. It is a brutal reminder that narratives are never neutral. Some lives make headlines, others barely earn hashtags. But the story does not end with outrage at foreign hypocrisy. The speaker forces the lens inward toward Africa itself. He admits with painful honesty that the continent has sometimes wounded its own reputation so deeply that even absurd accusations find fertile soil abroad. Across Africa, the world has watched leaders who speak of democracy while crushing dissent by night. It has watched constitutions bent and twisted to extend presidencies. It has seen opposition figures jailed, exiled, or quietly disappeared. It has witnessed elections so hollow they resemble theater more than civic duty. State resources have been siphoned into private accounts while schools crumble, hospitals rot, and public trust collapses. And then come the coups. From Mali to Burkina Faso, from Guinea to Niger, and now Guinea-Bissau soldiers have stepped forward declaring they must save the nation from corruption or constitutional manipulation. Whether one agrees with these coups is irrelevant. What matters is the truth behind them. They arise from a continental crisis of credibility. People no longer trust the systems meant to protect them, and when institutions fail, citizens, especially the youth, look elsewhere for solutions even if those solutions are dangerous. Against this backdrop, misinformation thrives. Disinformation networks, both foreign and local, exploit every crack, every wound, every broken promise. They take legitimate grievances and lace them with poison. They turn tragedy into vengeance and politics into theater, and yet, as the speaker warns, lies only topple houses that already have cracks. A nation with strong institutions can withstand propaganda. A nation weakened from within can be shattered by a whisper. This is why the G20 conflict was more than a diplomatic embarrassment. It was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that the world sees Africa not only through the lens of its potential, but also through the shadow of its failures. And unless those failures are confronted honestly, foreign narratives, true or false, will continue to define the continent. Because in the end, the greatest danger is not that others lie about Africa. The greatest danger is when Africa begins to lie to itself. Civil and political consequences when global drama meets daily reality. While headlines focused on the U.S. boycott and the political theater surrounding the G20, ordinary South Africans were left facing a harsher, quieter truth. The gap between diplomatic rhetoric and lived reality is vast. Inside the conference halls, leaders spoke passionately about economic growth, climate justice, and mineral sovereignty. But outside in the streets and in the homes of everyday citizens, life remained stubbornly unchanged. In many communities, unemployment, especially among the youth, remains devastatingly high. Young graduates sit on porches scrolling through job listings that never call back. Parents in townships work 2 or 3 informal jobs just to afford food and transportation. The wealthy build taller walls, hire more guards, install more cameras. But the poor, they rely on prayer luck and the hope that tonight will not be the night thieves break their door. Electricity failures continue to interrupt daily life. For small businesses, each blackout is more than an inconvenience. It is a threat to survival. Meat spoils, machines shut down, clinics lose power at critical moments, investors hesitate. The distance between the boardroom optimism of "we have turned a corner" and the daily frustrations of the average citizen feels like 2 different countries living side by side. And then there is the burden carried by local governments. In too many municipalities, corruption has hollowed out basic services. Water systems leak, roads crumble, trash piles up on sidewalks because the service contract was awarded to someone's cousin rather than to a qualified operator. Citizens don't need policy papers to tell them something has gone wrong. They can see it in potholes, broken streetlights, and the struggle to get any public office to answer the phone. This is where the civil consequences of the G20 quarrel collide with political consequences at home. Because when Washington weaponized misinformation, Pretoria pointed outward, accusing specific individuals and networks of feeding false stories into foreign political systems. Those accusations may be true. South Africa is not unique in having political actors who run to foreign powers when they lose influence at home. In many African countries, elites whose fortunes have faded suddenly reinvent themselves as whistleblowers for foreign governments or lobby groups. They export their grievances, mix fact with fiction, and become valuable tools for outside interests. But the speaker reminds us of a harder truth: disinformation only succeeds when a nation's internal foundations are already weak. A well-governed country can withstand lies the way a well-built house survives a storm. But when institutions are riddled with cracks, corruption, lack of transparency, politicized policing, weak oversight, a whisper becomes an earthquake. This creates a dangerous cycle. Foreign narratives undermine trust. Domestic failures reinforce those narratives. Citizens become cynical, governments become defensive, and accountability evaporates in the shouting match. All of this is happening precisely when a new generation of Africans is becoming more vocal, more politically aware, and more impatient. Across the continent, young people are asking hard questions. Why is public office treated like a reward instead of a responsibility? Why do taxes rise while services collapse? Why do leaders talk endlessly about reform while corruption cases drag on for years? Why must so many young Africans risk drowning in the Mediterranean just to find dignity abroad? Some take to the streets facing tear gas, rubber bullets, and the threat of arrest. Others mobilize online using satire, data analysis, and relentless commentary to expose problems traditional media avoids. They are not merely reacting, they are actively shaping political discourse. But the speaker issues a warning filled with affection and severity. Anger alone will not save a nation. Strategy will, organization will, discipline will. A movement that burns bright today can vanish tomorrow if it does not build institutions, study the law, engage in elections, and defend the truth, even when it is inconvenient. Ultimately, the civil and political consequences of this G20 crisis reveal one simple fact. The real battlefield is not the summit floor, it is the everyday life of citizens, the strength of institutions, and the courage of the young to demand a better country without destroying it in the process. How America sees Africa and how the world is shifting around it. To fully understand the weight of this G20 dispute, we must step back and see the broader geopolitical canvas. Because this moment was never just about South Africa. It was about how America views a changing continent and how other global powers are quietly stepping into the vacuum. For decades, U.S. foreign policy toward Africa has oscillated between indifference and selective outrage. Washington speaks the language of democracy and human rights, but often through the lens of strategic interests. When an African government aligns with U.S. security priorities, it is praised as a regional leader. When that same government questions Western dominance or builds ties with alternative partners, suddenly its institutions are scrutinized, its human rights record amplified, its internal divisions magnified. South Africa's growing alignment with BRICS, China, Russia, India, Brazil, and the emerging global South has not gone unnoticed. Washington sees BRICS not as an economic coalition, but as a potential counterweight to Western influence. And in recent years, South Africa has taken bold positions that sharply diverge from U.S. policy. It criticized Western sanctions and the global financial system. It demanded reforms at the IMF and World Bank. It openly challenged Israel at the International Court of Justice over allegations of genocide in Gaza. It strengthened ties with China on technology, infrastructure, and trade. These moves have unsettled policymakers in Washington who now view South Africa less as a cooperative partner and more as a symbolic battleground in a new geopolitical struggle. But America is not the only voice reacting. Europe, torn between values and interests, European leaders, though uneasy with South Africa's positions on Gaza and Russia, remain wary of alienating one of Africa's most influential states. Europe depends on African minerals, African markets, and African cooperation on migration. Many in Brussels fear that pushing Pretoria too hard will only accelerate its tilt toward Beijing or Moscow. Asia and the global South seeing opportunity. Meanwhile, China, India, Turkey, and Gulf nations quietly expand their roles. They offer investment without lecture partnership, without political strings. Whether this is beneficial or dangerous depends on the country, but it undeniably appeals to African governments tired of Western pressure. And what of Africa itself? The speaker stresses one timeless lesson: the world's reactions will always reflect its interests, so Africa must define its own. If African nations want debt, justice, climate justice, and fair trade, they must first strengthen their own governance. A world that sees Africa divided will treat it as a playground. A world that sees Africa united will be forced to treat it as a partner. A question for viewers. What happened at the G20 is not just a story about Africa. It is a story about America's changing role in a multipolar world and whether the U.S. can adapt to a future where African nations speak with confidence, clarity, and independence. A final warning, a wider lens, and a call to those who still care. As the lights dimmed in the G20 hall and the cameras shifted away from the empty American chair, one truth remained impossible to ignore. This was never just about a boycott. It was a test of South Africa's dignity, of Africa's maturity, and of whether ordinary citizens would accept being defined by foreign narratives or rise to define themselves. History is knocking again. It asks South Africa whether the courage that dismantled apartheid still lives in its institutions, its leaders, and its people. It asks Africa whether summit speeches can finally become food on the table, safety in the streets, honesty in public offices. And it asks the United States whether it will apply its principles consistently or only when convenient. But above all, history asks something of us, of ordinary men and women watching from living rooms thousands of miles away. When lies are told about a nation, will we answer with truth and reform? When leaders fail, will we surrender to cynicism or will we organize for change? When the world treats Africa as a chessboard, will Africans accept that role or insist on being authors of their own future? These questions do not belong only to South Africa. They belong to every society where dignity is fragile and where the future depends on citizens who refuse to be distracted or divided. And that is why voices rising from across the continent, from Johannesburg to Ouagadougou, matter more than ever. Burkina Faso, under leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré, is rewriting its own chapter, raising debates about sovereignty reform and responsibility that echo far beyond its borders. Whether you agree with him or not, his rise forces us to ask who will shape Africa's next generation of leadership and what values will guide them. If you believe these conversations matter, please share this video. If you want more honest African news beyond headlines and noise, subscribe and let's keep the truth alive.